Well, good afternoon. I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time as we are going to be looking at marriage and kenosis. And so today's reading from Paul's letter to the Ephesians is all about the husband and wife relationship. Anybody out there fall into the category of being a husband or a wife or a spouse for that matter? If so, have you ever read the passage from Paul's letter to the Ephesians about the marriage relationship? So, I have been married for over 20 years now, and I have to say that my marriage has taught me a great deal, not just about my wife, who is here in this picture, Lael, but also about myself from an outside perspective, right? It's easy to see people and who they are and who they're not when you live with them 24/7. And the interesting thing about marriage, though, is it affords you with many opportunities to see yourself. I have seen myself be strong. I've seen myself be weak. I've seen myself be generous. I've seen myself be selfish. I've seen myself be loving. And I've seen myself be mean. And everything in between. The whole range of humanity, right, is lived out within the marriage. And there have been days where I felt like I really had a handle on my marriage and being a husband and a father. And then there's been days where I literally had to stop, get on my knees, and ask for God's divine assistance and guidance and strength. And I think this holds true for anyone who's ever been married. No matter how long you've been married, it's really a lesson in self-emptying love. So, what does Paul say in his letter to the Ephesians about marriage that we can take away today, right? That's the question. First, Paul says in Ephesians 5:21, "Be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ." And that word subordinate is hypotassomenoi, and it literally means to subject yourself to someone. So, subject yourself to someone. The idea here is that both the husband and the wife need to adopt this level of humility and try to take up the role of a subject attempting to treat their spouse like a queen or a king. Which is funny because the world really pushes back on that level of self-sacrifice and humility quite a bit. But I want us to recognize that this mutual submission, and let's just call it this royal treatment, is a prescription given to Christians trying to live into Christ's way. So this is not ever going to work if you have no personal relationship with God and no desire to follow Christ's path of self-emptying, because that's what Christ did. But if you're a Christian and you're trying to utilize your marriage as a tool in your spiritual formation and discipleship process, well, then this mutual submission and royal treatment is entered into out of reverence for Christ. And that was really what the whole verse said. Remember, it said there in Ephesians 5:21, "Be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ." So this is something that you're doing as a Christian in order to follow Christ's way of self-emptying. You're utilizing your marriage for kenosis. And that's how I got the title today, Marriage and Kenosis. And this is no surprise, really, because Ephesians is all about how we might utilize everyday little aspects of our life for the divine purpose of growing more and more and more into Christ's likeness and mystically union with God. So if that's not your goal, if your goal is not to follow Christ and to utilize your marriage and other parts of your life to practice kenosis and self-emptying for the purpose of union, if that's not your goal, throw this to the side and just do whatever the world says will bring you happiness in your marriage. But it's going to look different from a worldly perspective than from a spiritual perspective with this goal in mind, right? Because marriage is a sacrament for this purpose. Okay, so if we're following Christ's humble servant, self-emptying path towards union with God, it's important to know then we need to look at these passages in Ephesians 5 with the understanding that these are prescriptions on how we might utilize various aspects of our life, like our marriage relationship, to aid us in that self-emptying journey towards union with God, and place these recommendations within the context of bringing everything in our life to bear on this road towards Christ-likeness and self-emptying and union. And so we see this is the whole point when we back up and we read the beginning of chapter 5 of the letter to the Ephesians. So at the beginning of that letter, we have the overarching kind of focus of what he's going to unpack. And he says there in Ephesians 5:12, that should be 1 through 2 actually, in Ephesians 5, 1 through 2, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up. He emptied himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. So the question here is, how did Christ treat his bride, which was the church? He treated it as if she were royalty, as if the church itself were royalty, worthy of love and self-emptying sacrifice. And that is a high call, right? The concept of self-emptying in the Greek is called kenosis, as I've mentioned this before, right? And we see this kind of idea of self-emptying exemplified in the letter to Philippians, chapter 2, verse 5 through 8, where we read this: let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, ekkenosin, coming from the Greek word keno, right? Taking the form of a slave. That's one who subjects themselves to another. Being born in human likeness and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. So we need to have this understanding of how we might utilize our marriage relationships as Christians to help us, right, on this self-emptying path to union, following Christ's way, as he showed us that, right? But also recognize that if our goal is not truly to imitate Christ's self-emptying love that leads to union, then this type of advice, this type of biblical marriage advice is just going to be swallowed up by the world and seen as some kind of ridiculous compromise. Like, you know, you don't subject yourself to each other, don't treat each other like kings and queens, you know, like, and so there's a lot of secular ideology and philosophy about marriage that's not going to line up with this. What you have to separate is that this is a biblical prescription that has an eye to your salvation and sanctification. And the idea is utilizing your marriage in such a way that you experience self-emptying love for your partner. And in doing that and joining into that flesh and self-emptying yourself out of love for the other and this mutual submission and all that, your marriage can become a tool in that process. And that doesn't mean you're always going to be perfect at it, or it doesn't also always mean that your marriage is going to look perfect from the outside, because sometimes when you're in the middle of your deepest self-emptying, it could look like your marriage is in hard time. And it might be, though, that God is using your marriage at that time to really get you to a deeper level of spirituality, utilizing your marriage for that purpose. So it all depends. What are you using your marriage for? Is it for personal gratification? Is it for sanctification? That's kind of, a trick question that is based in duality. And that's my application today, right? How are you utilizing your marriage? Is it for personal gratification or sanctification? And realize that those two things do not have to be either or. That's a trick question. It's a dualistic question. The fact is, a Christian utilizes their marriage for both. And so, yes, your marriage can bring great satisfaction, great gratification, great fulfillment. But don't forget this other piece about what the marriage is for from a biblical perspective, and that is for further sanctification of you as a follower of Christ. So if you're a follower of Christ, you're going to be trying to utilize your marriage relationship to help you understand this idea of self-emptying love. Because let me tell you, after 20 years of marriage, I've seen many opportunities to self-empty myself for the sake of love, and my wife has probably seen more than me because I'm not easy to get along with and live with, but she's been doing a good job. Anyway, thank you for joining me today as we have looked at marriage and kenosis. Hope you join me next week.